Well, good morning, everyone. What a delight to see you all. Good morning to those who are here in the Eastern time zone. Good afternoon and good evening, or good very, very, very early morning to those who are joining us from other parts of the world. We've got a full group joining us virtually. My name is Khalil Shariff. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aga Khan Foundation Canada. We're joining you here from the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate in Ottawa, the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, who for centuries came to this place here where the three rivers meet in a spirit of exchange of goods and services for sure, but also of relationships and of course of ideas. And so in a sense, we are carrying on that centuries old tradition made hospitable by the indigenous people of this land, by bringing people together to relate to each other and to think and to share ideas. Today, actually, ideas about some very important issues that the world is confronting. We're delighted to be hosting you all here. I want to thank right off the top, Global Affairs Canada, which is our long-term partner in convening on issues of importance to the global development community here in Ottawa. You'll be meeting some people from Global Affairs Canada over the course of our session today. But I wanted to say two things as we begin and before I launch the formal program. The first is that we are beginning to see some glimmers of light at the end of this long COVID tunnel. I think our attention is continuing to turn now to that long shadow that COVID is casting across so much of the world, and especially, of course, the developing world. I think what we've learned, if nothing else, is that COVID has appeared to us in disguise. It has come bearing the costume of a health crisis, but once it's demasked, it's clear that this is actually not just a health crisis, and maybe not even principally a health crisis. We know that for most of humanity, COVID has represented a massive economic crisis. We know that it has caused a massive food security crisis. We know we have seen extraordinary backsliding on all the important dimensions of gender equality, which we have been committed to and working so hard around the world to advance. And of particular importance today, it has caused a global education crisis. And in fact, my own personal view is that our focus and work on addressing the educational consequences of COVID is likely to be the most significant now effort that we will collectively mount, because the generational consequences of what we have just experienced as a global educational community are severe. I am delighted today that we are bringing together an important group of thinkers and practitioners who are going to help us sort through some of the strands of consequence and implication of COVID. The reason, though, we have come together is because of a very extraordinary effort by a group of students at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, led by the inimitable Professor Fernando Reimers, who's with us today, to actually take some important work that's been going on globally via UNESCO and give it voice in the context of specific situations around the world. I'm not going to ruin much more of the surprise. I'm going to let Fernando introduce this effort and the students in a few moments. But what I want to say is that one of the strands of this very important UNESCO report, if you have not seen it, it is only the third such commission on education that UNESCO has convened in its 70 or 80 decade history. If you have not seen the report, it's well worth looking at because it addresses head on our contemporary circumstance, not our contemporary education circumstance. It confronts head on the global circumstance we confront as humanity, and then draws out its educational implications. And one of the levers it looks at is the role of knowledge institutions and universities in addressing and advancing our collective educational goals. Now, that's of particularly interest to the Aga Khan Development Network because as part of the family of institutions that we have been establishing and supporting are universities, higher education, education institutions in the developing world that are meant to be part of the institutional landscape that are advancing our key development goals in the countries that we are operating. And so this particular strand is of particular interest to us. And this story you're going to hear today is an extraordinary example of students and universities coming together to address and advance collective thinking on key educational priorities. So I think it's really fitting that we bring them all here today. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to Professor Reimers is that Canada and the Aga Khan Development Network have had a very long history of collaboration in education in many parts of the world. The Aga Khan Development Network's own history goes back to the first schools, which were established in East Africa and South Asia over 100 years ago. That commitment has extended in many, many forms, focusing on looking at the problems of educational quality and access and how they can be advanced. And I have to say that Canada has been one of our principal global partners in this work. And for that, I'm very, very grateful, not only as a funding matter, but as an intellectual partner, as a source of institutional support, as a source of global HR. It's been an extraordinary collaboration. And so I'm really delighted that we're having this conversation, that we've got people from Global Affairs Canada here. But I want to first introduce the very important guest who's going to start our conversation off, and that's Professor Fernando Reimers, who is the Ford Foundation Professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm not going to belabor his bio. Let me just simply say that there are very few people in the world today who bridge the academy with the practical considerations of our global educational crisis. And Professor Reimers is one of them. He has not only been thinking and teaching about this, his research capacity is absolutely extraordinary. I can't even count the number of COVID-related research efforts that Professor Reimers has already published, let alone the amount that he's still involved in. And the beauty of his work has not only been his engagement of students, but it is to outline both difficulties and opportunities, to look for ways in which we might find, I think, what he calls silver linings, even in the most difficult situation, including COVID. And so I commend to you Professor Reimers' work and his research, and I'm delighted that Professor Reimers has agreed to join us. He's got other pressing commitments. I understand the Congress of the United States is at his doorstep, and so he might have to leave us a few minutes earlier than we'd expected, but we've got plenty of time in the first part of this conversation to listen and learn from him. So Professor Reimers, let me thank you for joining us. Let me hand it over to you to introduce this important effort that the students have been a part of, and then we'll come back to draw a few conclusions as well. Professor Reimers, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Khalil, for this very kind presentation. And thank you to the Aga Khan Development Network for the opportunity to join you in this conversation today. I so appreciate what the Aga Khan Development Network is doing in creating an opportunity for dialogue around how do we make the world better through education. We're meeting this morning at the very same time that the heads of state of many nations are meeting at the 77th General Assembly of the United Nations. And beginning this Friday, the UN is going to convene an education summit, one of the few summits where the United Nations is devoting exclusively to education. And the intellectual bedrock of that summit is UNESCO's recently published report on the futures of education. In its almost 8 decades history, UNESCO has 3 times convened an independent commission of experts who were asked to look at the most pressing challenges of our time and who were asked to produce a provocation, an invitation to education leaders about which are the ways forward to education. The first time UNESCO did that was in 1968, a time of great turmoil around the world, in which Edgar Faure, former Minister of Education of France, was asked to chair an international commission that published in 1972 the report Learning to Be. And the big idea of that report was that the world was and would continue to change much faster than educational institutions. And as a result of that, one of the most important things that fundamental education should do was to provide the capacity to learn throughout life. The second time UNESCO convened a similar commission was in 1992, when it asked Jacques Delors, the former president of the European Commission, to head an international commission that examined where was the world headed at that time. And the trigger of that commission were all the changes that technologies were introducing to economies and frankly to opportunities for social participation. And in 1996, that commission produced a report titled Learning the Treasure Within. And the big idea of that report was that the growing demands of participation, civic, social, economic, require that education try to do not one thing in terms of the capacities it would develop, but four. Develop learning to know, develop learning to do, to use what one knew to solve problems, develop the capacity to manage oneself, learning to be, and most importantly, learning to live together. Because that report anticipated that one of the consequences of globalization is that it would bring together people from different cultural, religious backgrounds, and it was fundamental to cultivate the capacities of people to see those differences in an enlightened way, to see those differences as the opportunity they are for productive collaboration and not as a threat. Because if people were not prepared to see those differences as an opportunity, this would inevitably lead to social conflicts of various kinds. And sadly, we see today in the world many indications that we have a lot of work to do in preparing every person to see cultural, religious, racial, ethnic diversity as the manifestation of strength, of richness that it is, and not as a threat. The third time UNESCO convened a similar commission was in the fall, in September of 2019, in the heels of the General Assembly, when the Director General of UNESCO, Dre Azoulay, asked the current president of Ethiopia, then President, Madame Saleh Work Zut, to head a similar commission in which I had the privilege to participate. Now, our commission met for the first time in January of 2020. And even though COVID had already begun, little did we know that a couple of months later, the World Health Organization would declare COVID a global pandemic that would upend much of the world as we know it, certainly the functioning of educational institutions, but also our capacity to meet in person as we had planned over the last 2 years. So this commission did its work in the middle of the context of COVID and mostly remotely, using the power of telecommunication technologies to help us do that work. Now, how is this report different from the previous two? Well, one important way is that this is the first report whose chairwoman is a woman, an African woman from the South, a sitting president. I want to emphasize the importance of that. The second way in which this report is important is that most of the members of this commission represent the global South. And the third ways in which this report differs from other two is that half of the members of this commission are either professors or former faculty members and administrators of universities. Now, the report has three sections. The first part talks about the challenges of our time, the challenges to human rights, an idea, a very powerful idea crafted at the end of World War II to help us bring about a world in which there would be stability and peace. And an idea that is under siege in many parts of the world. The second challenge that the report takes on is democratic backsliding. By all indicators, democracies are under siege. They're under siege in the United States, they're under siege in Canada, and they're under siege by bigoted, extremely intolerant groups that under the guise of an intolerant populism begin to divide people in us versus them, exactly the opposite of what we need to bring the world together. The third challenge this report takes on is the challenge of climate change, the challenges of social fragmentation, of violence, and so on. The second section of this report, which also makes it different from the previous two, says we absolutely must transform the culture of educational institutions. Now that's a tall order. It doesn't say we should deliver books to every kid. It doesn't say we should emphasize fundamental literacy. It says we should change the way we think about what it means to teach and to learn what, for what purpose, and in what way. And to do that, the report says everyone has to be implicated. There is no way that any government, any educational authority can wave a magic wand and just mandate the change of schools. The change in these mindsets is only going to take place if everyone, students, teachers, parents, administrators at all levels of the education system, organizations of civil society, engage in conversations such as the conversation that the Aga Khan Development Network is convening today, this very meeting, about these very questions. And so the report says that will require that we reimagine curriculum, that we reimagine pedagogy, that we reimagine the very organization of schools, that we reimagine who do we think of as a teacher and how do we support them and how do we organize them, and that we reimagine the ecosystem that connects educational institutions, creating a seamless opportunity for people to learn anytime, anywhere, at any point in their lives. And the third part of the report, perhaps the one where the report is most different from previous reports. Previous reports had been written largely addressed to an audience of education decision makers. And this report instead is built on the premise that everyone has a change maker and is potentially a change maker, and that we need to create avenues for that. So the report presents itself as unfinished work, as an invitation to a process of co-construction in which different people, such as the group of professionals who's going to be presenting their work today, need to participate. And the report says there are 4 levers of change. As Khalil Shariff just anticipated, one of them is social dialogue, as a dialogue we're having today. The second one is research and innovation, the generation of knowledge, so that change is done based on expertise, based on innovation. The third lever of change, the third catalytic action, is universities, more integrated in greater partnership with the rest of educational institutions. And the last lever of change is a reimagined form of educational cooperation. More South-South cooperation, more cooperation that involves organizations of civil society, such as the Aga Khan Development Network, not just governments, and so on. So onwards to the report we're presenting today. The report we're presenting today is the result of the excellent work of Farhan Karim, Ishani Parekh, Cecelia Scheuer, and Nathalia Trujillo, who are joining us today and who are going to present their work in just a moment. At the time when they did this work, they were students of the master's program in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And they had enrolled in my course on education policy. And they did that as we were doing the report on the futures of education. As I mentioned, I was a member of that commission. So I tried to put in practice what the reform preached, which is that students had to have a voice at all levels of the education system, and that educational institutions had to connect with other entities in trying to solve big challenges. So we reached to the Aga Khan Development Network and we said, would you be interested in building a partnership over a semester with these very talented students to solve a problem that COVID has created and to help lay the intellectual foundations, help generate the knowledge base that would help build back better? And they were very receptive, extremely receptive. They said, by all means. One of the things that challenged us in the context of Kenya is that we had a range of programs to empower girls and women. And we had to pivot those programs just like everybody did under COVID. And we wonder, what did we succeed? What could we be doing differently? So this group of students examined the pivot of those programs and analyzed what had worked, what hadn't, and used the best available knowledge based on global best practices and research to make a series of recommendations, which the Aga Khan Development Network then took very seriously. And the feedback we received from them was very positive in saying this was really useful. This partnership actually helped us to have the time and the energy and the commitment of 4 dedicated, smart individuals to think with us about what we're doing was very fruitful. So that's the work that we're going to hear today. I commend Farhan, Ishani, Cecelia, Nathalia for their excellent work. I thank the Aga Khan Development Network first for their receptiveness to these students when they first approached them in doing that work, but even more importantly, for having used that work and for convening these conversations so that their work can be of benefit, not only to the Aga Khan Development Network in the context of Kenya, but beyond, as an example of what these kinds of partnerships between organizations of civil society, universities, and governments can deliver at these very challenging times. And I think that what they're doing is, in a way, walking the talk that is the center of the conversations at the United Nations in this education summit. They anticipated what the General Secretary and the other global leaders who will be meeting on Monday are going to be talking about how do we mobilize the collective capacity of educational institutions. The world has about 45,000 universities. Imagine if in every university in the world, students like Farhan, like Ishani, like Cecelia, and like Nathalia use a little bit of their time and their energy to engage with entities like the Aga Khan Development Network on behalf of advancing the educational opportunities of those who most need it to reinvent education. In a very short order, we would be actually producing the transformation of the culture of educational institutions so we address the challenges that we face. And with that, let me turn it over to the speakers of the hour, to Farhan, Ishani, Cecelia, and Nathalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Reimers, for that introduction. We're going to have a chance to come back to you after the students, but let's hand it over to this excellent group of students, or I guess graduates now, Farhan, Cecelia, Ishani, and Nathalia. Over to you.
Thank you so very much, both Khalil and Professor Reimers, for that kind introduction. And I guess just wondering if it's possible to have the slides up or projected on the screen. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So really, thank you again for that kind introduction. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us, I know both virtually and in person today. By way of a quick reminder, I'm Farhan, and I'm joined by my colleagues and now friends, Ishani, Cecelia, and Nathalia. And it's our privilege to have been asked to start this conversation by sharing a paper that we completed during our time in Professor Reimers' course, Education Policy and Analysis, Research in a Comparative Perspective. And the course really served as an introduction into the field of comparative and international education, but also into the areas of policy and kind of project planning. And so I'm going to pass it off to Cecelia, who will still take us through the introductory slide and the title slide. So Cecelia, over to you before we continue.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us all here today. Before we formally begin, we would be remiss not to thank and extend our gratitude to Professor Reimers for his guidance, advice, and quite literally constant support throughout this project, but also to AKF and AKFC for their willingness to even work with us. It takes a lot of trust for an organization like AKF to extend the opportunity to work with 4 graduate students, and even more so in the spirit in which they did, as a serious learning opportunity for us, but also in the careful consideration with which they engaged our work. To this end, I'd like to acknowledge the team at AKF and AKF East Africa who ultimately made our work possible. Dr. Andrew Cunningham, Dr. Akila Datu, and Rupert Corpushley for their leadership, support, and guidance throughout this entire process. If I could have the next slide, please, that would be wonderful. We'd like to preface our presentation by noting that responding to the challenges of COVID-19, as Professor Reimers stated, is not one separate from the themes discussed in UNESCO's Reimagining Our Futures Together report. The challenge of uncertainty remains core to both building back after the pandemic and reimagining the future of education altogether. The global education landscape today is unpredictable. And as the UNESCO report observes in its foreword, quote, "If anything has brought us together over the last year and a half, it is our feeling of vulnerability about the present and uncertainty about the future." To contextualize our project, I will give a brief overview of 1, AKF's activity as it concerns their Foundations for Learning program in East Africa, and 2, the challenge facing AKF in the context of COVID-19. AKF's Foundations for Learning project is part of a much larger 5-year initiative entitled Foundations of Education and Empowerment, funded by Global Affairs Canada and the Aga Khan Foundation, which aims to improve both educational systems at the pre-primary and primary level, as well as strengthen women's empowerment and gender equality in 5 countries: Kenya, Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda. Now, given the time constraints that we faced as students and being able to undertake this project within 1 semester, our policy analysis restricted itself to FRL's educational programming and its COVID-19 response in Kenya's primary education system. The challenge we identified was ultimately one of program adaptation in a changed context and uncertain future. The original FRL program developed before the pandemic aimed to strengthen the delivery of gender-responsive education in Kenya. However, we know that the pandemic altered the context of Kenyan society in ways that both exacerbated and created new challenges for the education of primary school girls, and thus demanded nuanced responses. The primary question then facing our group was, how does AKF implement or adapt its existing program to strengthen the delivery of gender-responsive education considering COVID-19's impact? What is the nature of the programmatic changes needed, and how would AKF be best situated to respond? It's now my pleasure to hand it off to Nathalia, who will take us through the next section.
Thank you, Cecelia. Would I be able to have the next slide, please? Thank you. So examining this policy challenge required us to anchor our analysis in Bardag's 8-step framework to policy development. This involved 1, identifying the problem, 2, assembling evidence, 3, constructing alternatives, 4, selecting the criteria, 5, projecting outcomes, 6, confronting trade-offs, 7, making recommendations, and 8, telling the story. Identifying the problem and assembling the evidence required us to hold interviews with AKF staff, including teachers and staff members in the field, as well as local experts and key figures in the education and development fields. Our interviews were supplemented with extensive desk research and literature on previous pandemics and relevant contexts, an overview of gender-based inequalities and gender-based violence. While seemingly simple in its organization, our experience following this framework quickly increased in complexity. We were faced with limitations in our understanding of the context, research, and field. The study proved to be a lesson in intellectual humility, forcing us to reflect on our own positionality and privilege as external students far removed from the field and events on the ground. Next slide, please. Following this policy analysis process, however, did also lead us to important findings regarding the impact of COVID-19 on educational opportunity in Kenya. We know that in March 2020, the pandemic caused Kenyan schools to close, leading to a disruption in learning for more than 18 million students. A survey of the literature found that the critical impacts on educational opportunity included 1, declining mental health, 2, economic constraints, 3, desperate access to technology, 4, learning loss from school closures, 5, a lack of teacher preparation to facilitate online teaching, and 6, an increased burden placed on parents to support learning. We also found that these impacts disproportionately affected women and girls, which exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. To assess the impact, we saw the emergence of 4 main themes. 1, a rise in sexual and gender-based violence. 2, a rise in the digital gender divide. 3, a decrease in economic security and livelihood. And 4, decreased enrollment upon the reopening of schools. I will now briefly provide an overview of key facts. First, studies showed that the closing of public physical spaces led to an increase of reported sexual and gender-based violence, with 49% of cases being of emotional and physical abuse. Secondly, the shift to online learning raised concerns around access to education, particularly for girls in rural areas. Whilst many households lack stable internet and electronic devices, this was exacerbated by traditional gender norms. For instance, we learned that in Kenyan households, it is traditionally men who have access to these devices, limiting girls' capacity to keep up with homeschooling materials. Similarly, girls were also expected to contribute to household chores at the higher rate than boys. our research revealed that 76% of Kenyan girls reported an increase in household chores compared to 46% of boys. Thirdly, the pandemic also triggered an unemployment crisis in Kenya that exacerbated economic burdens for women and girls. Studies found that 3 out of 10 girls reported getting married due to financial pressures, and those who got married eventually dropped out of school. Additionally, as economic constraints grew, so did transactional sexual relationships, which rose by 27.5%, contributing to the rise in teenage pregnancies. Lastly, the pandemic disproportionately affected school enrollment rates for girls. Reasons for the lack of enrollment range from an inability to pay school fees to discriminatory practices on the part of schools. Ultimately, 84% of girls were expected to re-enroll in schools compared to 92% of boys. Collectively, these factors have led to a decline in mental health, with studies citing an increase in anxiety and depression. These facts helped inform and contextualize our policy recommendations. It is my pleasure to now hand it over to Ishani, who will walk us through our different policy options.
Thank you, Nathalia. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So once we ascertain the impact of COVID-19 on the landscape of educational opportunity, our next task was to, 1, develop a variety of policy options for AKF's implementation, and 2, evaluate these options using specific sets of criteria to present a final recommendation. After careful thought and deliberation, our group came to 4 policy options. The first, or status quo option, was to make no changes to the original FRL program and leave the program without any modifications apart from those which they had already made in the first few months of the pandemic. The second option relied heavily on our understanding of the impact of sexual and gender-based violence arising out of the pandemic, and aimed to provide gender-responsive and trauma-informed training for school counselors. The third option acknowledged the impact of the digital divide and its disproportionate impact on girls, and was targeted at improving blended learning through teacher training along with the provision of electronic devices. The fourth option, in tackling the challenge of low re-enrollment and based on a study of successful interventions in other geographies, was to provide cash transfers to encourage re-enrollment for out-of-school youth. Evaluating the viability of these policy options required us to use 5 key criteria. 1, feasibility, or how achievable the policy option was given AKF's capabilities and resources. 2, scalability, the potential for the policy option to be replicated at scale in similar contexts. 3, cost effectiveness. 4, equity. And 5, institutional alignment, or how well these policies align with the institutional, and in this case, AKF's and the wider AKDN's values. Based on a review of best practices in the field and an assessment of our criteria, policy options 2, which was counselor training, and 3, improving blended learning through teacher training and distributing digital devices, emerged as the most viable and impactful recommendations for Kenya's educational context. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So our final recommendation was that of an integrated approach of combining policy option 2 and 3, as they addressed different yet equally pressing concerns while remaining within the program's budget and building on AKF's strong institutional advantages. So what do these recommendations actually entail? Well, in providing training to school counselors, policy option 2 addresses the pressing concern around the increase in sexual and gender-based violence and deterioration of mental health during the pandemic, as well as promoting a safe and supportive school culture for students. Based on our research of best practice, we suggest this policy include trauma-informed training on the gendered impacts of the pandemic, outreach to community organizations, and training teachers on effective communication and collaboration strategies. Policy option 3 addressed the pressing concerns and the lack of preparedness for online and blended learning by providing teacher training on digital competencies, as well as electronic devices for students who lack access. I'd like to pass on to Farhan, who will conclude by speaking about some of the final reflections that our group realized as we worked through this process.
Thank you so much, Ishani. If we could put up the last slide, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So it's my pleasure to now share with you some of the wider reflections about our experience, not only working together as a group, but also some lessons we learned going through this policy evaluation exercise. And really, we hope that these reflections are ones that speak across just beyond our specific case study, but really speak to the tensions, debates, and questions that lie at the heart of today's upcoming conversation. And so really the first lesson we realized was the importance of gender inclusivity in the world today, an issue that goes beyond just building back better from COVID-19, but one really that resonates in all aspects of life. And so as the UNESCO report observes, quote, the past 50 years of progress have been vastly uneven, and today's gaps in access, participation, and outcomes are based on yesterday's exclusions and oppressions. Tomorrow's progress is dependent not only on their correction, but on a questioning of the assumptions and arrangements that resulted in these inequalities and asymmetries. Gender equality, for example, should not only be seen as a goal in its own right, but as a prerequisite for ensuring sustainable futures of education. The second lesson we learned was that of contextual relevance and the importance of inclusive design. And it's one that Nathalia alluded to earlier. So as students examining a context and policy from Cambridge, Massachusetts, we were all too aware of our own positionality, privilege, and status as outsiders, as students with little experience in the field and with little contextual expertise. So how does one then design policy that is pluralist and inclusive, that acknowledges the constraints and challenges of real-world political, economic, and cultural asymmetries? How do we ensure that these challenges are acknowledged in the real corridors of policymaking? And how does one reflect the nuance of traditions, norms, and values that exist in a diversity of contexts across the globe? Our final lesson was the lesson of uncertainty and fragility. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the vulnerability of the human condition. And as the threat of climate change looms larger and larger over the horizon, we are reminded of our increasing dependency on each other. And while this can be a source of comfort, it can also feed into harmful and damaging attitudes and emotions. For with dependency comes vulnerability, and with vulnerability comes fear, isolation, and sometimes the tendency to turn inward. How then do we design policy that is optimistic in its outlook, confident in its position, and aspirational for its vision in the future? In some policy that inspires hope as much as it enacts change. And so really those were the three reflections we left coming away with this exercise. And again, it's been a pleasure to be with you all today. And on behalf of the four of us, thank you again for the opportunity. And we look forward to what we hope will be a very exciting panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. A big round of applause to this team of alumni, I guess now, from the Harvard Graduate School of Education who have done this great work. On behalf of AKF, let me thank you for the insights you have brought to this work. And I think we can all see how thoughtful and thorough and concise you've been in presenting it. So thank you. For those of you who are interested in this, it is actually been published as a book that is available. The series of case studies, I think that the class put together across different parts of the world is available as a book, and the team will put the link in the chat, I'm sure, for all those who are interested in seeing some of the other students' work. Okay, I'm going to bring up our panelists now. Louise, Sarah, why don't you join me up here? And I think we're going to look for Atrash online. So I'm delighted that we'll be able to now reflect on what we've heard so far with a group of really thoughtful and experienced panelists. Louise Holt, on my far left, is the Director General for Social Development at Global Affairs Canada, a long history at Global Affairs, including with, I think, the AKDN in Global Affairs, going back to your time in Kenya, maybe 10 years ago. Yeah, yeah. So Louise, thank you. Great to have you here. I've got on my immediate left, Sara McGinty, who is with Plan International Canada and has just joined Plan after serving as Chief of Education for UNICEF in Sudan, Rwanda, and Tajikistan. and she's had a career in a number of other parts of the world as well. So Sara, welcome. Great to have you on stage with us. And my old friend and colleague, Atrash Ali, is joining us from Kenya. He's the area manager for our program in coastal Kenya and has been working in the education sector for 3 or 4 lifetimes, I think it's fair to say, Atrash, and has been really at the heart of so much of AKF's work in education in Kenya during that period. So Atrash, lovely to see you and great to have you with us as well. Atrash, I'm going to start with you to reflect a little bit about what you've heard from the students. There you are in Kenya. You've been involved in education in the country and with AKF for so long. Along come these bright young students helping us puzzle through some of the gender equality challenges that COVID has posed. You've now had a chance, I think, to reflect for some time on what they've recommended. What are your own reflections on what you've heard from the students, and how is it affecting the course of our programming now in Kenya?
Thank you very much, Khalil. I quite agree with their recommendation, and also with the suggestion that there is need to integrate recommendation number 2 and number 3, because when I looked at recommendation number 3, as a country currently we are at a place where we are going through immense economic challenges. Just 2 days or 3 days ago, when our new president was being swearing in, he was telling us that he has inherited a government with a debt of over 10 trillion Kenyan shillings. So for them to be able to support and scale up this kind of policy on cash transfer might be a little bit difficult. Even though history has shown that previously we had cash transfer, which was being supported by the government. But then on the positive note, which the first student might also have observed, is that during the pandemic itself, especially from the teachers, there were several innovations that came in to support the children, either in the process of home learning or in the process of virtual learning, either using phones or so. It's created this kind, and through our schools 2030, we are now supporting teachers to go through a process of design thinking, which is systematic, to sort of unearth those kinds of innovative ideas and be able to document and use them. And then the other thing also on the positive note is that we have seen that both from the parent side or from the school immediate communities and the teachers themselves, there was a lot of resilience for them to try things and push their efforts to make sure that the children who are missing out school, the children especially from the rural and in the slums, they are also reached in a way to be supported in the best way they could. So that is also the other positive aspect that we really need to document and see how we can come up with a policy and be able to facilitate that further, and the government and other sectors and other players within education to support, continue with that kind of motivation with the teachers and the immediate school environment.
Can you say a little bit, Atrash, about the experience with distance and blended learning? I mean, what does it look like in the context of the coast there? Who has been able to participate? Who has not? What is the? Can you just outline both the promise and the peril of this mode of engagement? What have you taken now? What have you learned about all of this over the last 2 years?
The biggest problem that we are having in, I would say, the entire country, I mean, the entire continent of Africa or the developing and the developed world, is the problem of the digital divide. We have got people who can access, I think in Kenya, currently people who, in Africa, the people who can access digital gadgets, is around 26%, if I'm not wrong, based on the research that have been done. At least in Kenya, we are seeing strong penetration of internet across the rural areas. The government is putting a lot of effort, and we are seeing a lot of people now accessing internet. But unfortunately, the cost of the digital gadgets is still high and not affordable by many people. So if we put up this kind of virtual learning, and especially blended learning, where teachers or any other beneficiaries of the blended learning process cannot access the gadget, then unfortunately they miss out. But we have seen that especially those teachers who are in the urban setup, like for example, Mombasa, most of them, at least they have got smartphones and they can participate in the blended learning course or any kind of capacity building program that is put through a blended learning process. They can be able to access. But then we are seeing that currently, as we are moving with the Foundation for Learning, because in the coast region, the two geographical areas that we are targeting are rural areas, Kwale and Kilifi. And we are now seeing that the penetration of internet and the access to smartphone by many teachers and also parents, it's increasing by the day.
I'm gonna bring Professor Reimers in here to just reflect a little bit on what he's heard. One of the themes of Atrash's comments, I think, reflect a theme in your own COVID research, which is that there's been both real difficulty, but also all kinds of promising areas of innovation that we need to understand and support. Can you say a little bit about how we should think about both the crisis and the opportunities here, including on the technology side?
Absolutely, Khalil. Let me first talk about the crisis. The world is on fire, literally. If you look at the floods in Pakistan, if you look at the droughts in many different places, the challenge of climate change could not be more evident. It is also evident that we will not address that challenge unless we find a way to educate everyone so that they know how to live in a different way. So we can slow down the rate of climate change, because we can't revert it completely in the short term. Similarly, if you look at the challenges of democracy, it is evident that we're living a time perhaps not unlike the crisis created by the pandemic of 1918, which, if you remember, those of you who study history, gave rise to basically contributed to the breakdown of the Weimar Republic and gave rise to fascism in Germany and eventually to World War II. Just read the newspapers and look at what is happening with these neo-Nazi groups organizing all over the place, no less in the United States. And look at what they're doing and how they're taking control of major parties and challenging the very foundations of democracy, and so on and so forth. Now, in addition to those challenges which preceded COVID, those challenges have been aggravated by COVID. Why have they been aggravated by COVID? Because simply put, COVID represents the greatest calamity in the history of public education. It's not just what students did not learn, which has been investigated. It's that many of them disengaged from school and were pushed outside of school. So we now have, in a few hours, I'll be giving testimony to a committee of the US Congress based on the impact of COVID in Latin America. And it's clear that the progress of the last 2 decades of this region, including children, was wiped out, creating certainly the greatest calamity in the history of educational opportunity in this region, but putting the very survival of democracies in this region at risk. As Atrash has just mentioned, in sub-Saharan Africa, these were nations that were already stretched to their limit with external indebtedness, and they had to indebt themselves even further to cope with the public health emergency. So how can we address these challenges without a fundamental rethinking of the very issues that the Commission reports? So that creates the urgency. That is the reason the Secretary General of the UN chose to focus on education on the heels of the 77th General Assembly at this global summit. There are many issues that could have been the focus of a UN summit, climate change, you name it. And they chose education because education is the bedrock of our opportunity to address this crisis, but not if we stay on steady course, on autopilot. And that's why the opportunity created by this report on the futures of education that basically invites all of us as potential change makers, it's very important that we seize this window of opportunity. And one of the themes of this report is we're going to need new thinking, we're going to need innovation. Now, during this pandemic, tragic as the calamity was, people everywhere, especially those on the front lines of education, did things they had never done before. They basically make do with whatever they had to continue to educate children. And this should give us great hope that there was such an extraordinary commitment to the right of education, oftentimes from teachers who were not supported by the governments, oftentimes by parents and members of civil society and students themselves who were not supported by their educational administrator. In many ways, the pandemic upended the normal rules that govern how education systems function. And we learned something about the power of societies coming together on behalf of children. And we learned something about different ways to operate. And it's very important that we do not lose that innovation dividend. I have been for the last 2.5 years trying to study those silver linings. And I've done it for two reasons, because I think the pandemic is a once in a lifetime, a solar eclipse moment where basically we could do things that are not normally done. And we should try to understand, so what worked and what conditions made that possible? And frankly, also because I think it is essential that all of us working on education build hope. If we give hope at this moment, then I think a breakdown of societies as we know them, such as happened in 1918 in Germany, is going to be inevitable in many places as more and more people lose hope that the current social contract gives them any chance, or to their children a chance for a better future. And so I think for that reason, taking the time to study what was done using technology, sometimes not high-end technology, sometimes WhatsApp, sometimes DVDs, to help us do things that we hadn't done differently. Some of the findings of my own research on that innovation speak to the power of collaboration, the powers of teachers connecting with peers within their schools, across nations, and learning from one another. It speaks about the power of the creativity of teachers when they're given the freedom to do things that education systems don't normally allow them to do, to come up with solutions. It speaks to the professionalism of teachers and to the commitment of communities to educate their students. In many societies, communities are kept at the door of the school, big walls, big fences that make it impossible, where the teachers put themselves in the position of, well, we are the experts, we don't need you. We're going to kind of save your children from yourself. And I think what the pandemic taught us is that that stance is most unhelpful in a situation of crisis, but in any situation, that every parent has something to contribute, and that no one is more interested in the education of their children than their parent, and that it is a smart educator, the one who establishes a dialogue on the basis of respect and mutuality, and on the basis of collaborating, of partnership with the teachers. So I do think that there are tons of lessons on the power of technology. I probably don't have the time today to go to them, but I encourage you to look. We have 2 publications. One of the things that we did in partnership with the OECD, the World Bank, and the organization 100, beginning in April of 2020, a month after the pandemic had been declared, was to say, let's begin to document some of these innovations that are happening around the world, and let's disseminate them very quickly. And we took 2 weeks to produce rapid case studies. And you know what? The website in which we hosted those 45 case studies, which was a website in the OECD, I was told it's been the most consulted website in the history of the OECD. And so that speaks to the importance of trying to be of service to society and to those most in need at a time of great need, which is the time we live in. And then we publish, you can find that report, the OECD published that report, because what we see is that especially the first 6 months of the pandemic were a time when a lot of innovation was unleashed. And then as the pandemic continued, in a way, and systems return to their normal functioning, more bureaucratic functioning more governed by administrators saying, wait a moment, everybody has their place here. Let's not lose sight of the fact of who's in charge. We lost some of that innovation dividend. And I think we should examine that moment and remember that if we cope in the pandemic, it wasn't because ministers of education had the solutions. In fact, ministers of education had no clue of what to do in the pandemic. The people who had solutions were those who were close to the kids. That doesn't mean that ministers are unimportant, but it means they need to re-examine their relationship with the people. They need to move towards more democratic, more open, more participatory ways of engaging with the whole of society. And that is one of the big themes of this report, frankly, a theme that we could lose, because this theme says governments are not in charge, societies are in charge, and governments should approach the rest of society humbly, opening opportunities for participation. It's a message, frankly, that challenges much of how governments see the role in the rest of the world. So I'm not saying by any means that we don't need government, that we don't need financing. One of the greatest risks that we face is that education is going to move to the back seat of a priority because the economic and the health imperatives created by the pandemic are huge. That is one of the motivations of this summit, is to retain the priority of education. But that is going to require a lot more than a cabinet saying education is important. It's going to require people demanding that. And organizations like the Aga Khan have a huge opportunity, and universities, in mobilizing, in serving as a catalyst of this power of the people. Anyway, that's what I have to say.
Well,
I'm
an
sorry,
opportunity and an opportunity, I think, and a responsibility and even a burden. Professor Reimers, thank you. I know you may have to leave us soon, but we won't let you do that without taking our gratitude, not only for your participation here, but for the work you've been doing over the last many years, but especially over the last few years on COVID. We'll make sure that in the follow-up email that goes to all the registrants, we point to some of the resources you talked about as well. So thank you very much, and good luck with your testimony to Congress later today. I want to bring in Sara McGinty and Louise into this conversation as well before we open it up for questions. Sara, you've seen a number of different geographic contexts, both other parts of Africa, but beyond as well. One of the themes that we're seeing is that, COVID was a once in a lifetime moment to unleash a bunch of innovation, and this idea that that innovation was coming at the front line, that unleashing the profession in a sense, in a way that was unburdened by the bureaucracies of every education system, seemed to have been kind of a particular magic moment. Can you just reflect a bit on how you think about that in the various contexts you have seen, and what it suggests about how we should kind of steer this going forward?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so to give a bit of background and context, my COVID experience was quite unique. I started in Rwanda, and unlike most of the internationals who evacuated or had to evacuate Rwanda, I stayed. And then after that, I moved to Sudan. Both countries experienced this very, very differently, but I have to say the innovation in both was very, very promising and very encouraging, and I think adds to what Professor Reimers was saying in the opportunities that are available that are coming out of COVID. In Rwanda, those of us that were working, the NGOs, the governments, and we worked and mobilized, and we implemented a number of different measures to make sure that kids were learning across a big range of types of learning. So we would use a bit more old-fashioned radio, which despite when you talk about digital technology, you want to use internet, the vast majority of people still have radio, and that's the biggest penetration. And so we really need to capitalize on that. We did use WhatsApp groups and send out messages to teachers and encouragement to the teachers, but also lesson plans. And we supported the teachers to go door to door to find the children themselves and to help and support their learning, especially in areas where the parents were otherwise working. And we know that, that was a common experience across a number of countries, including in Canada, where parents were juggling their role as educators, but also their main job that they had as well. Then I moved into Sudan. Sudan had a very different approach to COVID. Then Rwanda didn't lock down very much, or at least had lifted its lockdown by the time I got there, despite COVID prevalence. And we were able to do a lot there. And I really want to add, I mean, a lot of things have already been mentioned, but I think in a lot of countries right now, we're seeing a really big youth demographic coming up. Maybe not so much in Canada, but you do see this in sub-Saharan Africa, and the youth and the drive and the vision. And we see this with the master students here, in the ability to think outside the box, to reimagine how education can work and what can be done for that. And it was really exciting. I worked for with a team, all Sudanese led, and of youth. I gave them a budget, which was very, very generous, and said, go and do something with the internet. And they were IT background people. And I just had to guide them in how to do budgets or how to do M&E frameworks, but the design and the innovation that came out of this, and the platform, and they thought about it, and I would just push them, well, what have you done for children with disabilities on this platform? They would sit back and go, okay, let's go back and do that again. But they had this real drive, and they had a real drive to do it for their own country, and this real passion. So I think we need to also, when we talk about the opportunities that are available, is to capitalize on the youth and their energy and their ideas, because, you know, when the public education system was established so many years ago, the nature of work was so different than what we would imagine it today. And this evolving nature of work really requires us to rethink it. I was also speaking to a youth. We're preparing for the International Day of the Girl Child, which is coming up, and quite exciting. And I was paired with a high school student yesterday, and we started discussing, and we were discussing curriculum in Ontario and the books. And I will have to age myself. So I'm 45. And so her experience is 30 years after mine. And the books that she's studying, the curriculum that she's studying is the exact same books and the exact same curriculum that I studied 30 years ago. And we know what was wrong with some of that literature and how we have to reposition that literature so that the children in Ontario schools find themselves and are able to rethink it. And so that that experience is meaningful for them. And so I think we also need to rethink, but the nature of work that that girl is coming out of, and the challenges she's thinking about as she comes and it starts applying for university, and what that means for her was very different from my experience 30 years ago and what I thought would be a job. And of course, my trajectory was much different, but I thought I would be a teacher for the rest of my life, but I'm not. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, both with the technology. I think there's a lot of opportunity with youth. I think there's a lot of opportunity, as Professor Reimers says, with the evidence. And I think that's also something that's really important in education. I was always challenged because when you work at UNICEF, you have you know, the other departments of health and nutrition. And some of the health and nutrition evidence is really, really solid. If you get, well, we won't open the vaccine. Yeah, but you give vitamin A or vitamin C, you know what that's going to happen. And the evidence in education was always a bit lacking. And I think we're in this exciting time where there's a lot of evidence of what works now. We need to get that message out to people, because anyone who's ever been to school has an opinion about how education should be done and how you should program for education. And that's not always evidence-based. But I do think that we should capitalize, as Professor Reimers says, on this amazing opportunity to do more evidence and really build that base. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to bring Louise in and just let everyone know that we're going to open it up for a bit of a discussion. If you're joining us online, you can just put your question in the chat, and Sophia is going to help moderate that part of it. And I'll turn to her in a couple of minutes. And those of you who are in the room, we have a mic just there, so feel free to start reflecting on something you might want to pose. So Louise, we've heard about the difficulties, and we've heard about the possibilities coming out of COVID. Everyone agrees on the urgency. We're about to go into a global summit on this at a time when it kind of feels that the world is feeling not so prone to consensus. So kind of what is the prospect for concerted global action at a time when it feels like we are about as fractured and as polarized as ever?
Good question. Yeah, yes. So, I mean, a really, really relevant question. And I think in some ways that's actually a variation of a theme that we were left with from the students as well around, how do you bring some of this? Oh, is that better? There we, oh yeah, there we go. Okay. Never good with mics, thanks. No, really, really relevant question, obviously, and I think it also tracks back maybe to a variation, the same question that we heard that we were left with from the students and their challenge, right, of making relevant policy that's relevant to those on the ground, that reflects sort of what's needed, and how do you do that? And I think in some ways the question is the same. How do we at a global level? How do we, what is that consensus? How do we build the consensus and actually try to move that forward when there is there are a lot of distractions and a lot to working in that way. That said, I will also be like others here, I think, moving on to the Transforming Education Summit. And so certainly taking away all of these thoughts, absorbing this. And I think what everybody has been talking about is really relevant. So let me talk about sort of three thoughts or reflections on sort of past experience, because while I do think that there are lots of fractures right now, there have been in the past as well, and that there have been ebbs and flows and steps forward and steps back. But I do think that overall there have been steps forward when you sort of take that long-term view. So I think in the first instance, it is important not to forget that kind of the incrementalism of efforts at sort of every level and by everybody. And I think for us that's reflected in just ongoing sort of working through meaningful bilateral, multilateral engagement at the local level, at the country level, regional level, global level, through UN institutions, through negotiating resolutions at the United Nations, but also through participating and engaging in global partnerships, the work that we do in collaboration. I think that came up earlier as well, and bringing in your networks, whether through Aga Khan Foundation. And somebody was mentioning, everybody is change makers, and I don't think we forget that sort of at every single level. And it does have an impact over time. I know often when I'm going to the UN, people, friends, family, whatever, it's like, does that actually ever make a difference? A lot of money and time and, effort for these sort of big UN meetings. I believe that it does. And I do believe that if you look sort of over time, you do see that, and you do see progress emerging, notwithstanding challenges in developing consensus. The other thing, though, I think that is also really important part of that is continuing to focus conversations on what matters. I think that there can be a lot of discouragement from hearing, Professor Reimers mentioned as well, some of the what we're seeing happening around the backlash and regression. But I do think if you look maybe statistically, that's a vocal minority. There are also a lot of really positive things happening. There are a lot of really strong voices, not the least youth, who have really innovative, progressive messages and ideas, and not forgetting to amplify those voices, not forgetting to look at opportunities to listen, and not feeling constrained by the regressive voices to continuing to put those positive messages out there. So, I think at every opportunity, sort of we engage on those priorities. I think the big moments are important, and you try again, to seize those big moments. Obviously, COVID is an unprecedented big moment, and that importance of looking at how we seize that. There, no question that there are risks, and as Professor Reimers said, that's why the Secretary General has called the Transforming Education Summit. And I think collectively, let's look at how we seize that moment. I'll just refer again just to reinforce some of the positive sort of work. I think we had an opportunity as Canada a few years ago when we hosted the G7 in Charlevoix, and we are going to be reflecting back on that at the Transforming Education Summit, because I think we really took advantage of that moment as Canada, but as the international community, to look at the importance of education and to move that forward under the leadership of our government of the day and still our government under Prime Minister Trudeau, working with Canadian partners, really reinforce the importance of education, particularly for refugee and IDP children and youth. The government put $400 million Canadian on the table, and with that leveraged $4 billion US from commitments. And partners have actually made good on that commitment and implemented it, but they've implemented it through hundreds, thousands of projects at the local level, working with local partners and adhering to some of those principles of local voices, engaging youth, engaging local voices, and in making decisions and participating in the decision making that's going to impact them, which was a key theme of Charlevoix. And I think we've seen some huge progress from that. So maybe just to land a bit on that note, and it circles back to what you were saying, Sarah, it circles back, I think, a bit to what Atrash was saying and to what the students were saying and the work that they did. Is I don't think we can underestimate that the importance of local voices, of the importance of engaging people who know what they need and what works in their context. I think absolutely the youth and the increasing, so we talk about a youth bulge, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but there's no way that if we don't engage those voices in finding solutions and look to what is innovative in their space, that anything is going to hold and track. And so, just even again, hearing from Atrash, like when you were asking and hearing, what does that look like on the ground? There's no way we can make policy or program or tools or teacher training that's relevant if we're not understanding that context, if we're not engaging that context. And, where we've seen progress is when we have done that, where we have seen less progress. And to your point, Sarah, maybe, continuing to have 30-year-old outdated curriculum, we're not going to see as much progress. I'll just speak really quickly. You have to cut me off because it looks like I talk a lot longer on this. But again, just to, to your point, Sarah, we saw it at Charlevoix. Some of our Canadian CSO partners brought young women to the table and had our first ever discussion, closed door discussion with development ministers who were blown away by the young women that were sitting at the table with them from countries around the world. We recently, as part of our Together for Learning campaign at Global Affairs Canada, have set up what we call our Refugee Education Council. We have members from some of our partner countries, including Kenya, and representatives. We actually have two representatives from Kenya, one Kenyan teacher and one Sudanese refugee living in Kenya, who've been living in Dadaab, who are part of our council. We've got teachers, we have parents, and then youth representatives. And they have been very actively informing the work that we've been doing. And it's changed the questions that we ask ourselves. Again, going back to what we heard from the 4 students, I think today around what the questions that you're asking are very much shaped by their lived experiences. And I guess, again, we can't underscore the power of hearing those lived experiences. Again, I know personally, it speaks to, again, why I'm, again, so happy to be here. I mentioned that to you earlier, Khalil. I think throughout my career, some of my most powerful, impactful experiences have been just the opportunities to engage many times through AKFC, AKDN, either in country on the ground or here in Ottawa with youth and lived experiences, getting the 1-minute flag. So I will wrap up, but I really don't think we can underscore the impact of that. So creating those opportunities to engage, to amplify those voices at every level, right up to the global level, I think really holds a lot of promise for, circling back to your original question, breaking down some of the challenges of building consensus in difficult times.
Well, this has been an altogether more hopeful and optimistic conversation than I had expected, which I suppose is great news. Let's turn it over to you. Sophia, do we have any questions coming in? And if anyone here wants to signal an interest in adding to the conversation, just there's a mic right there and we'll come to you next. So Sophia, over to you.
We do have one question in the chat, but I did see Atrash put up his hand, so I think he wanted to respond
Atrash,
to
you
something
want to come
said.
in before we go to the floor?
Yes, quickly, Khalid, to answer to your question on the concerted global action. I think there are, I would say, universal principles that are cutting across almost all the countries. And I will mention three. One is there is a very strong belief in all the countries that education is a common good. And international bodies, including Aga Khan Development Network, can start from there. Then we need also, there is this belief that public education is here to stay. And during COVID time, we have seen that home education, virtual education have not been very successful. So public education is there and it needs to be supported. And then the other thing is the issue of building solidarity through understanding that education is transitioning, and especially in Africa, from old models of education to new models of education. And unfortunately, during the COVID time, this transition was affected. And this is now the moment which we need to catch up and pick up from here. Because before COVID, we had challenges of transitioning from old model of education to new model of education. And when COVID hit us, then we had to stop and focus on what is in the immediate. So I think those underlying principles can be able to consolidate that effort at the global level.
Great, thank you, Atrash. All important insights. Sophia, over to you for a question.
Yes, we have a question from Annie Kidder from People for Education, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Annie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful that this is happening at all. And I think my question is it's focused on Canada, because in response to Professor Reimers' thing about that we're in this kind of solar eclipse moment, and also the idea of fracturing and how hard it is right now to build consensus. My question has to do with, advice or insight into how to operate in a country like Canada, where there isn't any federal policy or any overall vision for education in the country. It's very strictly provincial, territorial. And how do we, are there ways, do you think, and that's what we're launching as an organization, how do we find the balance between that incredibly important need for the local conversation, for the lived experience, for the connections on the ground, but also kind of with the need for national conversations where you're building maybe a bigger consensus, and especially getting outside of the silo of education. Our theory is we need to have a lot more people in this dialogue thinking that education is our most important common good, that it is the foundation of for our future, that the bright future starts with good public education. But how do you do that in a country like Canada where it is very fractured in terms of education, and where do you think we can start to find those places where we can have a more effective dialogue about the importance of public education across the country?
In a decentralized education system, how do we have a national conversation? What is its role? I'm going to start with Atrash, if you can believe it. Atrash, Kenya has gone through a massive constitutional revolution in the last number of years, where education has been essentially decentralized to the counties. In a decentralized system in Kenya, what are you learning about the balance between the decentralized forces and the importance and role of a national conversation about these things?
One of the importance of decentralization is that we have seen, other than services being brought close to the people themselves, but there are opportunities which is close home for people to participate, for people to get opportunity to make decisions and air their voices, either directly through public participation or through their agencies like civil society organizations, especially those which are being supported to rebuild their capacity. So opportunities for people to participate and air their voices and make decisions towards what needs to be included in within the education system, and what is not need to be included has really been brought close to the people. But then, unfortunately, for the Kenyan context, is that there is still some functions that the national government and the county government, they are still grappling. And we need to do more in terms of separating and making it very clear and concise. How are these functions supposed to be run? What are the responsibility of the county government and what are the responsibility of the national government? I know we are still in the baby steps in terms of decentralization, but in terms of benefit, one of the most important benefits is the people participation in making decisions for their own on how to run education at their local level.
Thanks, Atrash. Sarah, Louise, any reflection on this question of how this all plays in Canada? What does it mean for Canadians to be involved in a national conversation, but also maybe the global conversation on this, Louise?
Yeah, sure. And again, not without challenges. I maybe here also just pick up on what Atrash said. I mean, I think that there are a few specific venues in Canada. We do have a Council of Ministers of Education in Canada who do bring together the provincial ministries of education. We work closely with them. I say we as the federal government at the federal level through global affairs, through ESDC. I'll make a plug here for the SDGs. Where having a national strategy on sustainable development goals provides an entree. We do have the CMEC ministers coming with us to the Transforming Education Summit. So they are actively participating. And again, I do think that that is a moment. COVID, no question, is also a moment, right? And I think as everybody has seen, we've parents, teachers, et cetera, in Canada have had some of the same challenges as parents, teachers, children, et cetera, around the world. And that's been a big education moment, I think, for a lot of us, for a lot of parents who perhaps took our education systems, access to childcare education, a bit for granted. So I think there's a lot more of awareness, and what it means to potentially lose that access has been a huge wake-up call, I think, for a lot of us. So a moment. But back to civil society organizations, and I'm going to give a plug here to AKFC because you guys have always done such a fabulous job about creating national conversations on issues around international development, raising awareness and engaging Canadians in, lots of creative ways, but through networks across the country and bringing folks together. And I think that, as Atrash said, civil society organizations and networks continue to play an important role in creating those dialogues. Yeah.
We have not run out of things to talk about, but we have unfortunately run out of time. I want to thank Louise and Sarah and Atrash for helping us puzzle through some of these issues. I want to particularly thank them for helping us see Professor Reimers' silver linings in these otherwise very gloomy clouds that COVID has cast over so much of the education debate around the world. So thank you for helping us ferret out the opportunities that we all now confront in advancing our collective educational goals for the world. So thank you very much. I'm going to release you from the stage as I ask Jean-Bernard Parenteau, the Director General for the Partnerships for Canadians branch of Global Affairs Canada, and a very, very strong partner of ours at AKFC, to come up and offer some closing remarks. Jean-Bernard.
Thank you, Khalil. What a rich discussion we had this morning. It does reinforces really my impression that we are at some sort of crossroads. There's a window, there's a COVID moment, as mentioned by Louise. The barriers for girls to succeed in school, it's not a new topic. I think it's abundantly clear that the impact of COVID-19 on girls has really exacerbated these existing inequalities. But what the pandemic maybe has also done, and this is recognized in the paper brought forward by the students, it did provide us with this opportunity to rethink gender responsive education in this new post-pandemic world. I should probably say in a world that will be more prone as well to new pandemic events. It gave as well the global community this opportunity to double down on gender equality and really truly attempt to build systems that will leave no one behind. I'd like really to celebrate the thoughtful work of the students on a really interesting case. The paper and the discussions are important elements to build knowledge, share analysis, and really move forward as a global community to ensuring that girls have all the tools they need to succeed in their studies. There's one interesting element in the paper I'd like to underline. It's really the notion that we don't always need large-scale policy changes, but rather sometimes just small pivots that can bring interesting changes to the education ecosystem and that can be adapted to the local context. It speaks to the need for these initiatives that we fund as the Government of Canada, as other donors, to be adaptable to changing circumstances. A key element as well I noted from Professor Reimers' intervention is this imperative to transform the culture of education institutions. The key question is, we're here to learn what, for what purpose, and the response is probably to learn to live together, to avoid those post-pandemic pitfalls mentioned by Professor Reimers, just like in 1918. And reimagine is probably a key word this morning. The students who participated this morning, the Canadian volunteers sent by AKFC to work in East Africa, in Asia as well on the L side, the Acadian expertise. All that together, I think, can help work on these promising areas of innovation that were mentioned and to disseminate evidence as well, as referred to by Sara. So I'm really thankful to AKFC, to you, Khalil. You brought together participants from distinct horizons, but all focused really on improving education's outcome around the world, and really focused about bringing their own small building blocks for a new social contract in education. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jean-Bernard. Thank you all. I mean, from grand historical narratives to very specific local examples of entrepreneurship, innovation, and change. I think we've really filtered a lot of issues. I think the phrase that is running through my mind or echoing through my mind is Professor Reimers as we come to a conclusion, which is that everyone is a change maker here. I think the idea of us looking at what our circle of influence is and trying to understand and advance some of these collective goals is available to us, and that we should move from now kind of thinking about the crisis to ferreting out the opportunities that it has also presented. So thank you to everyone who's participated. Thank you for everyone who's here and has overcome the inertia of the work from home moment to actually put on something respectable and come all the way here. And to those of you who are joining from around the world, whether you're dressed respectably or not, we're delighted to have you. A special thank you to the students whose papers spurred us to convene this conversation, which was really been exciting and inspiring. So thank you. And I wish and hope that you all find extraordinarily fulfilling and consequential careers in this area of work, which will be, I think, important for us and for the world.